We've been exploring together the notion of life as being a journey, and with the idea that there may be a goal to this journey, the discovery of the meaning of life, if of course there is a meaning. Now, during the Enlightenment period of the 18th century, it came to be understood that if there was any guide at all for this journey, it would have to be reason, and reason alone. Not faith, not tradition, and certainly not superstition. Now, the philosopher Kant, whom we've already looked at a bit, completely agreed that reason would need to be the guide. However, Kant understood reason, in fact, to be severely limited. But oddly, at the same time, he said, there are questions we have to ask, questions about the meaning of life, and we're only human if we ask those questions. Well, reason's limited, we must use reason, and yet meaning of life questions have to be asked, and reason perhaps can't fully help us answer them. What do we do? Where do we stand? Well, I think a brief review of Kant's account of reason in relation to the enterprise of metaphysics, the looking for something beyond the world as we know it, is bound to help us to understand Kant's somewhat complicated vision and his very influential legacy, as we're going to see. Now, Kant saw reason as a cognitive capacity, as something we use to know things, as having two very important limitations. One of those limitations was that Kant said that reason could only be used to interpret our experience. It could never know the way things truly are in themselves. Philosophers tend to use big words. Kant's word is transcendental, that there's a transcendental function of reason, that it interprets, but it never gives us full access to something called reality. Kant also said that our reason generates ideas. That is to say, ideas emerge that our minds aren't equipped to deal with and to find answers to, but we're trapped by these ideas. We can't escape them. We have to ask them. And with Kant saying that we have to ask these questions and that these questions and ideas are unavoidable for us, we seem to be in a very, very difficult situation. Kant thinks that the three main questions are, what can I know, what ought I do, and for what can I hope? But when Kant claims that we are in the pursuit of those questions, he claims that we get into a deep, deep difficulty. And that is that our reason gives rise to something he calls antinomies. We might call these contradictions. For instance, if we ask the question, are we really free? Do we have freedom? Kant says that if we assume we're free, well, contradictory consequences follow intellectually from believing we're free. But Kant says that if we assume we're not free, equally contradictory conclusions follow. So Kant thinks that shows that our reason is actually not equipped to deal with these matters. Further, he says that we can't help, after all, but assume that the universe began at some time and that it's limited in its circumference of space. But he says if we assume that, contradictions follow from that. And he says if we assume that time never had a beginning and that space is boundless, equally, contradictions arise. Well, where does this leave us? If we assume we're free, contradictions follow. If we assume we're not free but our activities are determined, contradictions follow. If we assume time had a beginning, contradictions follow. If we assume time never began, contradictions follow. Where does this leave us? And then Kant asks a question that is going to haunt us. It's going to bother us as we move along. He asks what we can say about our true nature. What are we really like? But remember, as I've already indicated, Kant says our reason can only interpret. But if it can't know what anything is like, then it also can't know what we ourselves are really like in ourselves. I think, frankly, Kant never found a way to say something that was exciting and interesting in a literary way. He says this in that kind of conceptual way that philosophers tend to say things. On the other hand, what Kant is doing in opening the door to claiming that we can't know what we're really like in our true nature, but we only know ourselves as we interpret ourselves, Kant is opening up the possibility that there's a deep, deep mystery to what it means to be human. Now, if we're going on a road together toward the meaning of life, if there is a meaning to life, and we can't even be sure what we are like as human beings, if Kant's right that we only have our appearance to ourselves, we can't grasp our true reality, well, how can we move toward the meaning of life then? How can we know there is one if we can't know what our true nature is? And every time we talk about things like freedom or whether time had a beginning, we fall into contradictions. Kant, in fact, says that if we try to prove things about our true nature, as opposed to how we appear to ourselves, we fall into something he calls paralogisms. What that simply means is that there are fallacies in reasoning involved in every attempt to argue and prove what our real nature is. Bottom line on this, Kant says that everything we experience is through interpretation. We even interpret our experience of ourselves, and therefore we never know our own true nature, only how we appear to ourselves. And if we're looking for the meaning of life, well, if we can't even know our own true nature, how should we be expected to determine what the meaning of life is? Clearly, we are in great difficulties from the standpoint of Kant's philosophy. And his particular account of reason, which says we must rely on it. It is our sole confident, our sole means of knowing. That account, when he tells us how limited our reason is, creates a kind of collision. What do we do in a situation where we must use our reason, we know it's limited, but we must ask these fundamental questions? Well, this raises huge, huge problems for Kant's successors. Some people have even said that the history of Western philosophy after Kant, at least on the continent of Europe, involves philosophers saying, Kant couldn't be right, but yet he says important things. Actually, that's the way you make a career, in a way, is saying things that are very difficult, very controversial, perhaps even obscure, but if you can get people talking about you, you've got something going. And philosophers talk about Kant even until today. Well, let's consider some of the reflections, the reactions to Kant. For one thing, the question was asked, what was the standpoint from which Kant spoke? After all, what does Kant tell us? Kant says everything we interpret. We even interpret our encounters with ourselves. But if we even interpret our encounter with ourselves, well, then we only have an interpretation. Where does Kant stand when he even says such a thing? Is he above the fray? Does he have a special insight? How does he get to where he gets? What is his standpoint? Further, Kant talks as if our reason is the same in all historical periods. It is the same in all cultures. Is it possible that our reason is culture-bound, that it's history-bound, that our reason may be different in one part of the world than in another? Is it possible that when you really come down to it, that reason changes over history? Critics of Kant looking back say, okay, we use our reason, it makes interpretations, but does it do it the same way all the time, in all cultural settings? Perhaps not. Perhaps Kant's even in some way provincial. Further, Kant has a conflict within his thinking, and it has to do with how he can claim to know what he knows. He says all kinds of things that follow from a set of categories, but the categories that he uses to explain things are categories that arise from a certain use of language. And it turns out to be that if you speak a standard average European language, for instance, the German language, Kant's categories then emerge. But what if you spoke a different language? Would you have different categories? Where does this stand? It's not clear. If you're feeling a confusion, let me tell you, I'm feeling a confusion too. What is Kant's standpoint? And Kant also has a notion of the I, capital I. You say the word I when you say, I think this. I say the word I when I think something. But Kant says this word I doesn't directly connect us with our inner selves. It's a concept we use. It's an important and convenient concept that we use. And in fact, Kant makes a distinction between three things. The concept of I, which we must use, it's part of our language. Our experience of ourselves in terms of categories where we could be objects studied by a physician or by a scientist. And then Kant also says, but underlying all that, there must be our true selves. But by the way, it is in the nature of our reason that we can't know this true self that each of us has or each of us is. Well, this is peculiar. This is the odd sort of thing that happens with these strange people called philosophers. Kant is telling us that we have to ask certain questions. We can't be sure of the source of the questions. We use the word I, but it's a concept we use, and it doesn't give us a pathway to an inner true self. So we are put in a strange kind of position by Kant. What we have in Kant then is how we could be studied objectively by science, but that's an interpretation. We've got the concept of I. We use it all the time. I think this, I want that. But it doesn't give us knowledge of an inner reality. And then we have the notion that there must be a source of ourselves, even though we're unable truly to know it. It's in some sense and must remain a mystery. Well, the notion of imagination is very central to Kant's philosophy. It is an important notion that he introduces, and what we'll need to see is that he doesn't mean the word imagination as we usually understand it. But this notion of imagination that we're now going to look at has extraordinarily important implications for philosophy and for our trip together as we are exploring the journey to what we hope could be construed as the meaning of life. Because Kant says in one of his major works, he says it almost out of the blue. He says that all of our knowing arises from something he calls the power of imagination. And then he says it's a blind but indispensable part of the human soul of which we're scarcely ever aware. We're supposed to use our reason. We are supposed to know, but all knowing, all use of our reason arises from a blind but indispensable something called imagination. And this imagination is something that is the power, the energy that drives our being. This is a central mystery in Kant. Let's consider it further. Let's think about it. You know, there's an old development that lives on in philosophy, and it has to do with the relation between power on the one hand and structure or form on the other. There's a long historical tradition in which anything, even the energy of the universe, could be altogether understood rationally in terms of structure. But there's another view that says there are at least some realities, and usually a candidate for one of these realities is the inner core of the self, that can't be known altogether rationally, that somehow it goes beneath or beyond our rational comprehension. Kant talks about imagination in suggestive and at the same time in problematic, even unfortunate ways. What do you say about the notion that there's an energy or power deeper than our reason, and that that energy or power that's deeper than our reason drives our understanding, and that we can't use our reason to get down to it, to find out its nature? But if we can't, and our knowledge is by means of reason, how does Kant even know there is such a power? As we continue our journey, what we're going to discover is that all kinds of philosophers agree with Kant that there is some blind, indispensable power at the very core of our being. And just possibly, whatever the meaning of life is, if life has a meaning, it will have to do with our coming into touch with, our coming to be one with whatever that deep-seated power is. And it might be non-rational. That is to say, it might be the sort of thing that is mysterious. But one thing is important for us to remember is our journey course, that is to say, our journey along the route to the meaning of life continues. This notion of a power, of some kind of energy that is the deepest element in us, will continue to be part of our thinking. Now, the label that Kant uses is the label imagination. As we go forward, other philosophers looking to think of ways of understanding how life is meaningful will be talking in ways very similar to Kant. They will be talking about some inner reality deeper than our reason, but they will not necessarily use the word imagination. As we're going to see, they may use other words. Now, the Romantics, for instance, and we'll be thinking about the Romantic tradition in a later lecture, are very caught up with this idea of an inner, irrational, perhaps even non-rational imagination. And for instance, Coleridge, the English poet, will take inspiration from Kant, and he will say that imagination is as important as anything can be, and it's the true source of our being, the absolutely true source of our being, and it is that from which any meaning for human life must arise. We turn to look now, reflect on, frankly worry about human freedom. Notice we've already said that Kant says that our minds are incapable of showing whether we're free or not free. And what Kant says on that basis is, since we can't prove we are or we aren't free, we'll just assume that we're free. He does make space. Space is available in his theoretical philosophy for freedom, because after all, he said, we can't know our true nature, therefore we couldn't know if we were free, and we can't know about freedom without falling into various contradictions. But what Kant does say, and I think is very important to consider, is that he says that we do experience in our lives a fundamental moral predicament. And that moral predicament is that we are constantly in a battle between our sense of duty, and our inclinations, between our rationality and our passions. Kant has something called a deontological stress. It means that one is to be judged, and one must judge oneself in terms of one's motives. That is to say, it's not so important what the consequences of our actions are. What really matters is our motivation. And in fact, he has ways of judging our motives. The battle is duty versus inclination, our reason versus our passion. But how can we know we have the right motives? How can we know that we're doing the right thing? Well, Kant offers two alternatives for evaluating motives. One alternative he offers is he says that you should consider whether what you're doing any other person should do in a similar circumstance. You should never make an exception of yourself. And another thing Kant says is that in whatever you do, you should always treat other people as ends and never use them as means. So reflect on this for a moment. Here is Kant, and he's given us a specific, somewhat austere battleground in which to live. You and I think, whatever our journey is in life, wherever we hope or expect to get, whether we consider there to be or not to be a meaning in life, we probably have a rich load of experience. Kant wants to narrow it down to reason versus passion, duty against inclination, wants to judge us all together in terms of our motives, our intentions. Are we acting out of respect for what we ought to do, something called the moral law, or are we just looking at consequences? By the way, in passing, something that clarifies this, something that we can get existentially anxious about if we like, the Internal Revenue Service has to prove intent if they think something has gone wrong. They're all together into motives. Kant would applaud the notion that what finally matters is motive. However, medicine is something else. If the surgeon comes in, you've had your leg taken off, you are in to have your tonsils out. If the surgeon says, I meant well, my motives were good, probably won't work. You'll probably end up suing the surgeon. You may win. We'll worry a little now if there's some surgeons among us on this journey of life. No harm meant. We just want to be very clear that for Kant, it is motive that matters. The fundamental motive is respect for the moral law, to purify our will so that we don't think about consequences. We just do what we ought to do. I think in John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, in the preface, something like the following is said. A person does what he or she must, regardless of personal consequences, and that's the essence of all human morality. And Kant agrees. Kant agrees that that's how life ought to be lived. Kant's views on religion are complex, significant. They give us a lot to think about. Kant has the notion of God as an absolutely necessary being. We could think of that as the God of the philosophers. It doesn't sound like a God we would bend our knee to, we would be devoted to, we would worship. Kant has an abstract philosophical notion of an absolutely necessary being. He says that you and I, along the journey of life, can't help but think about whether there is such a being. We can't know, but if we think as philosophical people, we will think that, yes, we have to reflect further on this. And it's Kant's view that as we reflect further on the notion of an absolutely necessary being, there are no proofs that work, no proofs that this absolutely necessary being exists. Kant himself, the person, is very wrapped up in what could be called teleological concerns. That is, he sees a kind of purposiveness in nature. He doesn't think you could prove it's there, but he has a sense that there is a kind of purposiveness in nature. And though he says proofs for a philosophical God, an absolutely necessary being, don't work, he has intimations through this sense of design, which he says you couldn't prove is there, but he has intimations that that tells us something about a powerful being beyond us. But how Kant actually works out his religious views for you and me, how he would construe religion related to us on the journey toward the meaning of life, is extraordinary. He thinks that religion must be understood thoroughly, rationally. We have to have a thoroughly rational conception of the religious life. We must not let our feelings be indulged. We must work thoroughly from within reason and from in the moral life. Kant claims to come up with an argument that would show that we're immortal. That argument goes as follows. We have the duty, which we would experience if we closely examined our inner lives, to perfect ourselves. And Kant claims that you could only have the strong sense of duty, which he says any of us would have if we concentrated on our inner moral life. You could only have that sense of duty if you were in fact able to discharge that duty. So, if we have this sense of duty, Kant claimed he did at least, to reach perfection, then we must be able to become perfect. And by perfect, he means completely moral, doing everything out of duty. Oh dear. What Kant tells us is that it's obvious to him, should be obvious to you and me, that in a finite period of time, that is the period of time allotted to us in this life, we couldn't perfect ourselves. But if we have that duty, and anything that we have a duty to do, we could, Kant says, therefore, there must be an infinite period of time available to us. If we have the duty and we can discharge it, you and I can become perfect, but we can't in this world. Then we must live long enough that that perfection could be achieved. Now, many philosophers looked at Kant, looked at his writings, saw the kind of genius he was, and said, but this doesn't add up. This is almost a crazy notion. Do we really have the obligation on ourselves to perfect ourselves? Does that mean, even if we had that obligation, that we could? Could that really mean we would live forever in order to become perfect? And Kant even adds to this. Kant even says, well, there must be a God, because after all, if you were perfect, well, then you should be rewarded with a complete happiness. And only an extraordinarily powerful being could give the kind of happiness you deserved if you became perfect. So it doesn't prove it, but there's something to the logic of moral life that suggests that God exists as the basis for rewarding us for having become perfect, that is morally pure, and we can do it. Well, this is extraordinary. This is an extraordinary set of doctrines, and the reactions to them are many, and many are even outraged by them. But this is the kind of confidence that Kant has. Let us move a little now toward a conclusion. Let us consider further these strange things that we've looked at. We've looked at a rational conception of human life. We have looked at the notion that we cannot really know our true nature. Kant tells us that nonetheless we can look within ourselves and discover duty, and the need for duty to fight desire, duty to fight inclination, reason to fight passion, and that we even can see that we have the duty to completely perfect ourselves along those lines. This is a very stern view. This is a very austere view. It's a view that puzzles some, it outrages others, but especially its austerity, the notion that reason would be caught up with moral duty and that religion would arise out of a rational conception of moral duty, virtually unhinged, or at least created an immensely strong reaction in a number of philosophers, particularly a group which we now call romantics. And it's the romantic reaction to Kant's rationalism that we'll be looking at in our next lecture, in our next time together, along the journey toward determining whether there is a meaning to life.